It's lovely to see how many of you have celebrates. Good. Good, good, good. What I'm going to show you tonight, you can do on any machine. So. I didn't see who that was that took their jacket into the baby look, Dina. Good stuff. Great. Well, it's really good to see you all. I think it's just coming up to 7 o'clock. And what I'm going to do tonight is, well, actually, I should always forget to introduce myself. My name is Deb Canham, and I teach sewing, but I really specialize on the serger because I love it. And what we're going to do tonight is we're going to look at working with fabrics that have a pile. And it may be that you think it's not really the best thing for the serger, but it is great on a serger. So let me show you what I've made. And I've made it for my youngest granddaughter. And it is it's difficult to get it all in, but it is a Cuddle kit blanket. Okay, and the front and back are both made out of Minky. I think that's what most of you will know it best as. It's also called Cuddle. There's lots of trade names for it. And it comes in a variety of different thicknesses. You can see the binding's quite a long pile, where the pink is a bit shorter. And if we go to the white, that's sort of in between. So that's what we're going to be working on the serger. It was a lot of fun to make. I have, through my life, worked with a lot of fur fabrics, and Minky is very soft. So I think that really helps. But it is, of course, a knit. But it really stretches across, but not so much up and down. So across the selvages, it will stretch more than up and down. And if you've ever used a fleece, it's much the same story with fleece. So what is Minky good for? Well, Minky is a knit, and it has a fur fabric pile on it, varying in, the length of it. And it is good for clothing. I'm planning on making a jacket for Claire in the winter. It's good for quilts. It's good for toys. And I noticed this week, Kathy, a lady in our group, my group's Deb Canham Serger Sanity Projects. And may I say that in that group, you will find files. Okay, there's files in that group. And if you look under it, I have a written file for this live tonight, just in case you miss a bit. So, what was I saying? Oh, quilts. So Kathy posted up a really nice baby's quilt in our group this week, and she had done it on the serger, and she had done some embroidery designs on it, and she had a cotton front and then a Minky back, and that's super popular at the moment. Why not have that lovely soft lush fabric on the back of the quilt? And she had also quilted it, and it was really very nice if you look in the group. So what are the things you need to know about working with Minky? Well, let me start off by saying this. It's a bit like working with a thick Crayola crayon as against a fine pencil. Okay, so you can't be too anxious or precise. It doesn't matter if something isn't quite perfect. That's a loose word, perfect. Because the pile is going to cover it. Okay, so when you're going to use this fabric, it's, as I say, like working with a thick Crayola crayon, just have fun with it. Don't go over anxious about it. Okay, so that's just setting you in the mood. Okay, it's a fun fabric. So does it give you problems on the serger? No, not at all. Not if you follow the following guidelines. So the first thing I'm going to say is you need a size 90 needle, and you need a ballpoint or a stretch needle, just a regular size 90 ballpoint or stretch needle. It doesn't matter. It's just the regular sewing machine stretch or ballpoint needle, and a size 90. And you're going to be better off using a polyester thread because it does have a little bit of stretch in it. The other thing you need to do is you need to lower your foot pressure because it's quite thick when you put the whole thing together. So to lower your foot pressure, you are going to find a knob. Now, it depends on which machine you've got. Some are at the very top And in the case of the Triumph and the Ovation, they're on the left-hand side. And let me say this to you. You need to turn it counterclockwise to reduce the pressure. Counterclockwise. Now, let me just show you a little bit about this particular quilt that I made so that I can show you how I made it. I'm going to say that you're going to use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. In the pattern, they use 1/2 inch. But I just want to show you there's 2 ways of doing it. And if you buy this kit, let me just show you the box it came in. I bought this as a kit, and it said it says Shannon Fabrics, and it says the Cuddle kit. Okay, and all my fabrics were in there. And while I've shown it to you, what I can't share with you enough is how soft and cuddly it is. So when you buy that kit, and I'm particularly going to work from this kit because that's what I used, you are going to get an instruction sheet, and you are going to get 2 different choices in which quilt you make. Now you could just do this one here with the stripes, or I actually did the applique, and I'll just tell you how I did that. And it has also videos to help you too, but we're doing this on the Serger. In their videos, mostly it's all on the sewing machine. And there's 2, so you have 2 choices, and then you have 2 further choices, because you can either put batting in it, or you don't have to put batting in it, okay? If you're going to put batting in it, you may want to stay with your sewing machine, although you could use a chain stitch. So let me just turn you around and show you how you're going to do the batting one, and why I say to perhaps use the sewing machine for that. So here is the batting one. I mean, I'm asking you to be creative because obviously it's a lot smaller than the original quilt, but it will show you the method. They use the flip and sew method. Let me move my applique stuff out of the way. They use the flip and sew method, and the batting is an integral part of that. So what you're going to do is what they do with this method is they literally sew across the seam onto the batting and turn it down, and they work their way up doing that with different layers. Okay, so you're just sewing it onto the batting and the fabric and turning it up, so at the end of it you've got all your stripes or fabrics attached to the batting. Okay, now to do that, we can't do that on the Serger because we'd have to carve through the batting, wouldn't we, unless we used a chain stitch, but I'm just doing Serger tonight. So if you're going to plan on putting batting in it, you're better off sticking with your sewing machine. But I didn't put batting in mine, okay? And the reason for that was I live in Florida and I thought it made it a little bit lighter. But I did do the version with the applique, so let me just show you that. Here's my applique. Now you are not going to go and fuse on the steamer seam fusing for attaching it to the fabric, because you can't use an iron on this, okay? So know that one. And then what you're going to do is you're going to cut your circles out, and then you're going to fussy cut the elephant. See, I chose that one, and then I changed my mind and went for that one, actually, because I made it a bit bigger. And then what you're going to do is, you can't do this on the Serger. This has to be done on the sewing machine, and you are going to go to your sewing machine and sew it on, okay? So you're going to sew the pink one onto the white circle, and then you're going to attach it to the grey. Now, the problem with this pile fabric is it tends to move, okay? So you're going to need to use pins, but you need to use pins with caution because it's very easy to lose a pin in the fur. And on my sewing machine, I used a Teflon foot because it really rode over the pile. It made it much easier. So I used a Teflon foot on my sewing machine. And I used a zigzag stitch. Okay, so I sewed that onto my grey panel, and then I sewed on my white strip. Now, let's just look at this fabric a little more, because as I said to you at the beginning, and I want to reiterate it now, it stretches across from selvage to selvage, so across this line, but it doesn't stretch going down, or at least not very much, not enough to worry about. So you need to bear that in mind, because when you're sewing a seam across, you need to use differential feed. But when you're sewing a seam down, you don't want to do that because you're going to end up with gathers in your fur fabric. Okay, so everybody clear on that one. So let me show you what I'm going to do next, which is I'm going to move it to my serger, just moving you over. And I'm actually sewing that across seam, okay? And it's going to be stretchy this way, not that way. So for this particular project, I am going to use my differential feed. And what I'm also going to do is make sure I don't run over pins, okay? I think this is a really dangerous project for running over pins. So in the main, I try, and you could certainly use clips for this bit, or at least pin the pins so they're not quite so near the top. So let me tell you, I'm working with 3 thread overlock wide. I have my stitch width on 7.5, and I have my stitch length on 3. And I've told you I'm going to be working across on the stretchy section. So I'm going to move my differential feed all the way up to 1.3. And does the stretch provide me with a problem? Not so very much. What is more the problem is the pile moving on the pile, okay? It tends to just move around a little. So that is going to be what I'm going to be looking out for. So I also want to say that I cut my white strip that goes across wider than I actually needed, because if I'm going to have a problem with this, as with all my serger projects and everything to do with the serger, it's more than likely going to be at the very beginning and very end. And I can always cut that off. So that's always my plan. And what I want to show you is that because of the pile, the thick pile, it may well move against itself, okay? And I've told you I'm only using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, why is that? Well, because if I choose to cut this, it's a knit. And also with some of the pile, it could be higher than the knife. So the easiest way to sew this fabric is to have a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and also it allows me to be accurate, but I'm going to literally run my raw edges against the knife. So that is going to help me because I'm not cutting. It's going to help me because it's accurate, and it's the easiest way to do it. So I'm going to sew along, and you should see, you know, it's always the way when I do a demo. It sometimes doesn't happen. Let me take these pins out because I actually don't need them. What I want to show you is that, do you see how it's riding up at the front? I always think it's a bit like coming across a humpback whale in the ocean. So what am I going to do now? I'm going to lift my foot, okay, and just readjust it, and you'll see it goes flat again. So we're going along, and there it comes up again. So lift your foot, relieve the tension under the foot. There it goes again. Just lift your foot. Now I've used a grey thread on this just because it's easier. It still has some stretch in it, which is good. And there I have the perfect seam, and there it is on the back. Okay, so that is your best method for attaching it. And when I said to you about using the 1/4 inch seam, of course, the other huge advantage, which I think I missed, was I can put it right back to my needles. And what does that do? It means all of my feed dogs are working for me. So let me just recap on that, because I think I might have missed that bit out. So the advantage of using a 1/4 inch seam allowance is I can start the seam at the needles. Perfect. So all those feed dogs are working for me. It's way more accurate and easier to get a straight line if you run the raw edge. And that's that on sewing it together. So let me just talk to you about cutting, because actually I missed that section out. I'm going to bring you around to me. Now, if I'm using a thin Minky, I'm just going to use my rotary cutter. And you are going to get fluff. So if you're one of those people that it sets your sneezing off, wear a mask. But also have a hoover or a vacuum ready to hoover up the excess. So in the main, I just used a rotary cutter. Now the exception might be if I'm using a longer pile, but I'll get to that in a minute. So using the method I've just done, we're going to sew those strips together, and at the end of it, you're going to need to true up your edges. That means you're going to need to make it straight. Okay, it could be that they have your white strip's going to be longer because you made it longer, or it could be it just ended up a bit longer. It happens, which is signaling me for a question.
What is a fussy cut?
What is a fussy cut? A fussy cut is when you cut out a certain section. Like this fabric had elephants all over it, and I just really wanted this one piece. So I cut it out so it was central. I didn't use it because I didn't quite make it central. So that is fussy cutting, where you take the time to choose what you want in your circle or your square, and maybe you center it. Okay, I like not to center things in general, but for this I felt it needed to be centered.
Could you use a walking foot?
For the somebody said, could you use a walking foot? For the applique, because I was working on all the pile, I chose to use the Teflon foot. It glided over my fur fabric. Now, if I was going to use the sewing machine to sew this, if I was going to perhaps use the method with the batting, where you had to sew it down to the batting, I would absolutely use a walking foot. Yes, I would.
And someone says something about a knee lift, whatever that is.
A knee lift. Yes, I don't do knee lifts. I'm just not coordinated enough. All it's going to do is lift your foot. So,
did you lock your knife?
Did I lock my knife? No, because my knife is my guide. I put my raw edge up to kissing the knife. That's going to give me the perfect edge. Okay? Perfect 1/4 of an inch. So let me just have a look. The other thing I want to mention is when you start sewing your strips together, you know, you have your fabric going on the quilt, you need to make sure it's all going in the same direction. So if I run my hand down, all my fabric is smooth. My pink, my white, my gray, it's all going in the same direction, okay? It has one direction. If I run my hand up, it's all going to be rough. And what you don't want is rough, flat, rough, flat. I mean, imagine a cat. Its fur goes from its head all the way to its tail in the same direction. Imagine if its legs, it went from its toes upwards. It would look funny, wouldn't it? Well, that's kind of how your quilt would look if you don't have it all going in the same direction. So that's something else you have to watch out for. Okay, so I told you I used a rotary cutter in the main on the short pile, but when it came to the longer pile, I like to use a knife if it's going to be visible. Okay, so we discussed whether to use a batting or not. Setting up Serger with 3-thread overlock. 3 things I need to watch out for when I'm sewing is all the nap pieces are going down. If it's going to be stretchy, if it's going across, I'm going to use my differential feed at 1.3. If I'm coming down the grain, I'm going to use my differential feed at normal because there is no stretch. Okay, cut your strip longer because it just makes it easier. So once you have your strip in, you're going to true up your edges, and then you are going to put the front on top of the back. Now you need to have wrong sides together, and then cut out your backing to match your front for this method. And I have one here. Okay, so here's mine. Have to be creative, it's a little one. So there's mine all marked, matched up. Okay, now because I'm using the serger and the way I'm doing it, I'm going to take this opportunity to actually sew all the way around my edges. Then when I come to line up my binding, I only have this and the binding to match up, okay, rather than three raw edges. Now, what I want to do is I want to make sure that my stitching, when I sew this all the way around, is much smaller than my stitch I've used. So for that point, I'm going to change my stitch to a 3-thread narrow. And what that does is it secures the edge, and it guarantees when I put my binding on that these stitches aren't going to show. And what else am I going to do? I'm going to make sure that when I sew across the top and when I sew across the bottom where the stretch is, I'm going to use my differential feed on 1.3, but when I sew down the edges, I'm just going to use normal. Okay, so this blanket has what they call a raw edge binding. So let me just show you on my quilt that I have done. So let me just move my camera over. And when I first saw this, I thought, not too sure about that, but it works a treat. Okay, so I forgot to move the camera. So here it is. So what you're going to do is you're going to sew your binding to the back. Okay, and it's in the written instructions, but basically you're going to take your binding and you're going to put right side to the right side of the back. And then you're going to sew it on, and I can show you that. I'm going to show you that because I think it's easier to see it. So let me just do that bit and we'll get on to what I'm going to do next with that binding. So here we have it. Okay, I'm not going to sew the whole binding on, but I think this is my binding strip. Yep. Nope, it's not. I have one cut ready to go. Here we are. So here I'm using white because actually the kit really just is enough to do the quilt. I didn't have any left over, so I do have some other fabric. So this is a white. So again, I'm going to put this up. Now, I don't want to sew the start of my binding because I'm going to have to join it. Okay, if you can't get your fabric where you need, pull off the stitches on the stitch finger to allow you to get in there. And again, I've changed back to a wide stitch. Okay, I used a narrow stitch to stitch these edges together. And what I'm going to do is I am just going to imagine this is the back and this is the right side, and I'm going to sew it onto here. So this side is it stretchy? Nope, it's not stretchy. This side is good. So I'm just going to stitch. Now, this is a little bit thicker. So when you get to do this, you might want to put your left hand behind. And that isn't to pull it through. It's so that you know if it's not moving. Now, it's moving just fine with this white fabric because it's a bit thinner. But I used the grey on my quilt and it did just a couple of times stop moving. So I just gave it a gentle tug. Okay. So when I get up to this corner here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut into my binding about 1/4 of an inch, maybe a fraction less, and pull it out of the way, because what I'm going to do is just stitch off this end. And I don't mind if I cut my initial stitches, my 3-thread narrow that's on there, it's not going to show. Okay, so I have come off this end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn that corner with that cut I made, put it right back under the needles. And sew again. Now this side is the stretchy side. So I have the blanket down. Do I need to use the differential feed? Now, in all honesty, at this point, because there's 2 layers of fabric and I've already sewn around it once, that's pretty much stabilized it. So for the binding, I actually left the differential feed on normal all the way through, attaching the binding, okay? And I'm just going to come around and I'm going to do that on all my corners and eventually join my binding at the end. Okay, and sew it on. So I'm going to come off here so I don't use up lots of time. So there is my binding, and remember this is the back, and I'm going to fold it over. You've got a nice corner there, and I'm going to sew it down on the front. And this is the point. It is a raw edge binding, because you're never going to see it's a raw edge once you've sewn it. So at this point, what you're going to do is you are going to pin it. Now, if you're using a really thick fabric, as I did, the grey, whatever you do, do not put your pins this way, because they're just so easy to miss. I know that one has a great big head on it, but take this little white one. It will vanish into the fur. Always pin that way, and that way you can clearly see that you're coming to a pin. So what you're going to do is fold that over, and you are going to go to your sewing machine, and you are going to set up with your walking foot on for a very large zigzag. I did 5, 5, 5 width, 5 length, and you are going to sew on your sewing machine along this edge and secure it down. And I know some of you'll say, oh no, it's a raw edge, but it's a fur fabric. You're never going to see it. Let me show you this one. So this is the raw edge I did, okay? And you can't see that it's a raw edge once it's sewn. What I do want to say to you is that I wished I had cut my raw edge a little bit better on my binding that I was sewing down, because it had quite long fur. So I just want to show you how I would do that. If I can find my piece of grey, which is here somewhere. So if I was going to do my binding again, I would draw a line on the back. I would mark my I actually used 1.5 inches, because I was using a 1/4 inch seam allowance as against a 1/2 inch, and I marked it there. And then I'm not going to do this on my machine, but on a cutting mat, I would use one of these scalpel blade type things to cut the line. And what that does is it gives you a much neater finish. See, it hasn't cut the fur, so it's a much nicer straight finish. So when I come to do that big zigzag, it's going to be a lot easier to do it, because I can see the edge. So I'm going to bring you around to me, and I'm going to answer any questions, and I'm going to have a little check and see if I missed anything.
Yeah.
I'm just going to add that I actually chose to do the 1/4 inch, so it gave me less on the back than it did on the front, okay? So if you don't like that, if you're a quilter that you don't like that kind of thing, you want it to be even, that isn't going to work for you. And I recommend that you use their method at the 1/2 inch on the sewing machine, okay? I've done that too, and that was quite tight. So I quite like my method. And what I did when I sewed the binding on was I had a grey in the front, and I had a pink on the back. So you can barely see my stitches at all. But the other thing I did, and I'm just going to turn you around and show you this, is I used something called I call it a teasel brush, okay? And it's a little wire brush. It's got lots of fur in it. And it's not for ripping the thing apart. It is for a gentle brush where the stitches are. So it's going to turn you around to my area again. So what that enables you to do is just use this little teasel brush on the fur, and you cannot see where the stitches ever were. So if you didn't like that line of stitches in from the binding, then just use a teasel brush and you'll get rid of it. So, coming back to me, questions, Richard?
Go over the settings again.
Settings are in the file. For the sewing machine, zigzag on the binding, I use 5 width, 5 length. For the serger, I use 7.5, the widest one, and a 3 stitch. And if I was going over stretchy, I use the differential feed, but not in the binding, because I'd already secured the edges before I did that. And I just want to show you a couple of other things. So this was using Cuddle. Beautiful, soft, once you've felt it. This is the perfect gift for grandbabies and children. And husbands. And the dog. Richard said, I want one. So let me just show you in flannel. I did exactly the same binding in the flannel, and actually I liked my method of using the 1/4 inch seam allowance to do it. And I also used the 1/2 inch, and the 1/2 inch is going to be just a little bit tighter. But you could do that on flannel too. Flannel is the same story, stretches wide and is pretty steady, stable going length. And I know somebody put up that they wanted to do a ladder stitch on 2 pieces of flannel. Now, if you're going to do that, you can't sew round first because your stitching will be visible. But this was using a flat lock stitch, and I used decorative thread in the upper looper needle because it has a different threading. You need to check your thread chart for that, and regular thread in the lower looper. And see, I stitched it. Now, if you look at it here, can you see that it doesn't look quite the same? Let me move you around to my other camera. I think it might be better for showing you this. So here we have it. I sewed it on using water-soluble solvay, and the reason for that is when you sew it, it doesn't look like that when you sew it. When you sew it, it looks like a regular stitch. You have to use the water-soluble solvay to pull the stitch over so that you get the blanket stitch. And you'll see that I chose to curve my edges, and that was because I didn't have to make a join. I could just go all the way around. And again, I used 1/4 inch, and I kept the raw edge to the knife. If you start cutting, it's not that it can't cut this, it can cut it. But one, you're going to get a little bit of hindrance because it's a knit, and that's the big problem. And the other thing is it just keeps it very accurate. Learn to use your knife as a guide. So that's using ladder stitch. Would I use ladder stitch on these Cuddle? No, because it'll just look messy having those pretty stitches embedded in the fur. Okay, and another thing that I thought I might try was using flat lock to sew my strips together. But again, the stitches just messed up the flow of the fur. So that didn't work for me either. So sorry, questions? I had a lot to get through.
Well, is the Minky fabric on top and not on the feed dogs?
The Minky fabric's on the feed dogs, yeah.
Explain the knife to somebody, please.
The knife is acting as a guide. It's up. You're going to keep the edge of the fabric kissing that knife all the way through. That will give you the straightest seam. Okay, if you start cutting a knit, you're going to have problems, okay, particularly this one. Sometimes it's too thick and it's too high for the knife, and also when it cuts, it stretches, so you end up with it pulling away from the knife. So my recommendation with all stretchy knits is never to cut, just to run it along the edge of the knife. Perfect 1/4 inch seam if you use your stitch width and the 01 needle at 7.5. Okay.
Well, there's lots of other questions.
Lots of other
you
questions.
might want to look at them later on.
Somebody said, I can see some here. Somebody said when you use the machine zigzag on binding, was one hitting the binding and the other one hitting on the blanket? Yes, but only just hitting on the blanket. Keep it mainly on the fur, okay? Just hitting on the blanket. So.
Someone said, how do you do the corners? But you've gone over that one. Is the wide stitch a 1/4 inch? I think you've gone over that one.
Oh, about the knife cutter I was used. Okay, let me tell you about my knife cutter. It is I want to tell you also about the kit. Fiskars, and it came with 3 different blades, and actually I'm sure there was a better blade than that one, but this is the one I generally use, so I had it out. Any sharp blade will do it. I want to tell you about Shannon Fabrics kit because it is super cute. They have lots of different designs. You are going to find it in your favorite quilt shop. Okay, I see them all the time when I'm out on the road. And as I said, you can do it with batting or without. If you're going to use batting, then do it on the same machine. Did you use the Teflon foot? I used the Teflon foot to sew the applique onto the fur fabric because it was working on the fur. Did I use it on the serger? No, I didn't. But if you think about it, I had the fur sandwiched. I was always serging on the wrong, you know, with the outside of the foot. If I had had a Teflon foot, I might have tried it. But my feeling is you're probably better off with your regular foot, okay? Because you want all that contact with the feed dogs too. We carry the kits. Okay, Jan carries the kits. I can't tell you how much fun it is to sew. It makes a fabulous, fabulous gift. Takes no time to sew together. It's foolproof. You can't mess it up. If you make a mistake, it's never going to show. It's got fur fabric. It's really fun to use. And as far as the machine, did the machine get really? No, the machine didn't get all jammed, you know, all fluffed up, because I used the 1/4 inch seam allowance, so I wasn't cutting with it. Did my cutting table get all fluffed up? Yes. Yes, my table over there needs hoovering again. But my machine really didn't get that fluffy because I wasn't cutting it. So, what is the little brush called? The little brush, I call it a teasel brush. And I think that comes from teasels. Remember, teasels have little hooks on them. They're found in nature on trees. Don't ask me, I don't know. But this is a little brush. It's difficult to see because I've got so much fur in it. But it has little bent pieces of wire. Now, as I said, you don't go too heavy on it, okay? It's not for ripping it apart. It's just a gentle brush to pull up the pile. And I use these all the time when I'm using fur fabric. So, I think that's probably most of the questions. So, it is the Cuddle Kit by Shannon Fabrics. Lots of different colours and patterns, but lots of different furs too. I don't think I ever showed you the back one. It's pink. It's got stars on. There's also and I love this one. This is it's kind of swirly, and that's the one I want to make a jacket for Claire. And I know she's going to want one of these blankets too once she sees Evie's. So yes, right. What else did I have to tell you? Not much, because I knew it was going to be a long run. I think it's just to tell you that I'm actually going to keep my discount this week on patterns, and it's 20% off if you type in FL83, and that's FL lowercase 83 in the coupon code box. To remind you, the written instructions for this, one, you do get written instructions with your Cuddle Kit, but for the Serger, the written instructions are in my group, Deb Canham Serger Sanity Projects, under files, and they're already up. So, where did I buy the little brush for the nap? I always have one. I've always have. I've got lots. I don't know. You might want to look online for it. I don't think it will be everywhere, but they are there. Okay. So anyway, if I haven't answered your questions, I will go back through and type a reply. I want to thank you for coming in and joining me. I hope you found it fun. I hope you'll post up pictures. And don't forget, you can use it for clothing and back of quilts. I think that's such a great thing. And Kathy that had done it the other day, what I really, really liked about it was she had machine stitched her quilting on there. And it looked just fabulous on the Minky, even though it has a pile, you know. So that's another thought too. And next week, I'm going to... Yeah, people are saying if it's irritating you, you can put it in the tumble dryer and get the fur off. I think there's lots of different techniques for that. If you have it on your table, a damp cloth will take it off. That information's in the file. But next week I might cover a bit more on blanket stitch. Okay. So yes, Judy wrote up, you put it in your tumble dryer and tumble it on low. Now remember, you're not going to use an iron on this. Okay, no iron. No iron. Anyway, listen, thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you're going to post up the pictures. They're super fun, super quick. And I will see you next Monday. I will be here next Monday. So thank you. Good night.